It looks like it's the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to the Montana Institute's weekly seminar series, The Rough Cut. I'm Paige Tollison, and I'm pleased to welcome you today. This fall, we are highlighting the important topics of climate change and its impacts, so please be sure to check the calendar for upcoming talks in the Rough Cut series, which includes next week's talk by Executive Director of Environmental Stewardship at Providence, Dr. Beth Shank. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Richard Reddy, who will speak on federal climate policy. Dr. Reddy is a professor in the Department of Agriculture, Economics, and Economics at Montana State University. His research explores how people benefit from and value the services provided by ecosystems. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We encourage you to keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation and to join in for questions at the end of the talk. I'll keep track of questions in the chat, and you can also use the raise hand function. With all of that being said, I will hand it off to you, Rich.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paige. As Paige said, I'm in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics. I am an economist, so I'm going to be looking at these questions through the lens of how an economist sees things. I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to try to accomplish today. First, I want to kind of give you some context about why right now is an especially critical time for climate policy. Second, I want to kind of give you an appreciation that federal climate policy is made up of lots of different pieces. Some of them are big and make the headlines. Some of them are small or don't make the headlines, but might be equally important. Third, I think you'll get the impression that things have been changing under the Biden administration in a lot of ways that aren't making headlines. And then fourth, I want to give you a kind of an update on what's going on in Washington, D.C. this week, and give you an idea that things are happening right now that are fairly important. Some caveats, I'm going to be mostly talking about mitigation policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions rather than on adaptation policies. Second, I'm going to be focusing on the tools, the specific policies that try to get things to change on the ground, rather than talking much about goals or pledges that have been made. So, for example, the Biden administration recently said that they have a goal of 45% of electricity generation from solar by 2050. That's a goal. I'm more interested in how they're going to get there than in what goal they set. Third, this won't be an exhaustive discussion. There are a lot of pieces that I don't have time to get into. So for example, I'm not going to talk about renewable fuel standards or things like that. I'm going to mostly focus on things that seem to be in play right now. And then fourth, I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds, and hopefully I'll accomplish that. So a little context. There's kind of a general consensus globally that we need to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid some of the worst outcomes from climate change. In order to do that, we need to reduce our net emissions. We need to get the net emissions to reduce relatively soon, and they need to go negative by mid-century. The longer we wait to get on a path of reducing emissions, the more negative we're going to have to go in the out years. And negative emissions are hard. So the more we can reduce emissions early, the less we have to rely on negative emissions in the out years. So we're kind of, if you look at the graph there, you can see that the paths that the IPCC has identified that will keep us below 1.5 degrees of warming, most of them are tipping down by now or in the next year or two. So we're kind of the time is now to do something if that's our goal. In the United States, the only sector that's really had a downward trend is the electricity generation sector. All the other sectors have been fairly stable. Electricity generation only makes up about 1/4 of our total emissions. So we haven't turned the corner in any meaningful way, at least not yet. The pandemic did result in a decrease in emissions from the United States, mostly in the transportation and industry sectors. But we've seen a rebound, so there's not really been a lasting effect of the pandemic on emissions. So we need to turn the corner on emissions fast in order to hit that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. But there's little evidence that that's going to happen by itself, which is where policy steps in. We need to the federal government in particular needs to adopt policies that are going to change the way the economy is moving. I think it's helpful to kind of give a brief history of climate legislation. This is kind of the framework within which policy happens. And just to give an idea of kind of where things stand now. So if you go back, I'll start with the 2000 presidential campaign between George W. Bush and Al Gore. During the debates there, both candidates pledged to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant. After George W. Bush won that election, he quickly reversed himself and claimed that the Clean Air Act did not give the administration the authority to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant. That went to the court, and we'll see later on that there were some findings on that. During that decade, there were multiple times that cap and trade bills, bills to establish a carbon market, I'll talk more about what cap and trade bills look like, were introduced multiple times with Republican co-sponsors, including John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Susan Collins. They all failed in Congress, but there was some Republican support for climate legislation during that time. 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that the Clean Air Act does give the EPA authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions if it finds that carbon dioxide emissions endanger public health and welfare. In 2009, the EPA did find that greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health and welfare. That's what's called the endangerment finding. So at that point, it was established that not only does the EPA have the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, it is required by law to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So it has to do it. The problem is in 2010, Republicans took control of the House of Representatives and pretty much drew a line in the sand and said there will be no new climate legislation. And there hasn't really been any since then. There hasn't been any Republican buy-in for climate legislation since 2010. The Republicans have controlled at least one House since 2010 up until the most recent election. So that's where we're stuck until the most recent election. Now, in 2021, it's the first time in a decade that the Democrats have controlled both houses. And they're trying to push through some legislation that would have significant climate impacts. So there are 4 things going on right now. It's a very busy week in DC. In no particular order, there's a bipartisan infrastructure bill that is, and I'll talk more about that, that's passed the Senate and it includes $1 trillion for roads and bridges and internet and things like that, but it includes a fair amount of money for infrastructure that's related to climate change. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So that has passed the Senate and is waiting to be acted on by the House. There is a reconciliation bill, a budget reconciliation bill that is being constructed right now. Congress is allowed to pass 1 bill per year that's related to the budget that does not that can pass by a simple majority in the Senate, and these are called reconciliation bills. The one they're working on right now is for fiscal year 2022. The fiscal year 2021 bill was the coronavirus stimulus bill. So they're working on that right now. They can only include in the reconciliation bill pieces that are directly related to the budget that either raise revenues or spend money. Um, and This may be the last chance that the Democrats get at climate legislation. The the proposals right now, the things that are being included in the bill right now, include a fair amount on climate. I'll talk more about that later. But this may be the last chance for the Democrats to pass a bill with significant climate components. It's historically been true that the party that controls the White House loses seats in Congress in the midterms. So it's very likely that the Democrats will lose control of at least one side of Congress in 2022, at which point they probably would not be able to accomplish much on climate. So this may be their last bite at the apple for a while. Meanwhile, we have a couple other things going on. The fiscal year runs out, the new fiscal year starts Friday. We do not have budgets. We do not have appropriation bills for any of the agencies right now. So the traditional way that Congress deals with that is by passing a continuing resolution that extends the ability for the federal government to operate. So that's before Congress right now, needs to be passed by Friday, or else the government, at least large parts of the government, will shut down on Friday. And then we have a debt ceiling coming up. If we don't raise the debt ceiling is the legislative authority for the Treasury to borrow money. We're coming up against the authority that has been given to Treasury. So if that is not raised, then sometime in the middle of October, the US Treasury will run out of legislative authority to borrow money and could default on the US debt, which would be a very, very bad thing. So those are all the things that are going on right now in Washington, D.C. There's a lot going on, a lot of moving pieces. We'll come back to those toward the end. All right, I want to give you a feel for the different types of things that you could call federal climate policy. So I'm going to talk about 7 different types of policies or policy tools that are available, and talk a little briefly about each one and kind of what's been going on recently and how things have changed under the Biden administration relative to the Trump administration, and in some cases relative to the Obama administration. So the first has to do with policy analysis. Now, starting with the Reagan administration, there's been a rule that whenever an agency writes a new regulation, a large regulation, it must conduct an analysis that tallies up all of the benefits and costs that will result from that new regulation. In 2008, the courts ruled that the agencies have to include in that analysis an estimate of the costs and benefits related to climate change. So they need to use something called the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is a measure of the damage that occurs when 1 ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent are released into the atmosphere, and includes all of the damages that occur out into the future. So now the agencies, when they write new regulations, have to calculate this social cost of carbon and how it applies to their regulations. That was extended just this year to environmental impact statements conducted under NEPA. So anytime an agency makes any decision that has environmental impacts, it now must calculate the climate change impacts associated with that decision and value those using the social cost of carbon. So for example, a pipeline permit or a offshore oil lease sale. Now, when you do an environmental impact statement for those kinds of decisions, you have to include this social cost of carbon and account for the climate change impacts. Now, in 2010, after the courts ruled that the social cost of carbon needs to be included in regulatory impact assessments, there was a group from different agencies that got together and did some analysis and came up with an estimate of $43 per ton. That's the damage that's caused every time a ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent is released into the atmosphere. And that was used during the Obama administration. In 2020, the Trump administration, or I'm sorry, prior to 2020, the Trump administration revised that, made a couple changes to the way the calculation was made, and came up with a new number, $1 per ton. Now, clearly, that's going to make climate change impacts less important in government decisions. The Biden administration reevaluated that, and the current value that they are using is $51 per ton, and they have asked for a kind of an overhaul in how that number is calculated. A lot of economists are arguing that the number should be up above $100 per ton. So that should be coming probably within the next year as a new number there. So this use of the social cost of carbon is not definitive when making decisions. A agency can make a decision that's bad for the climate, but having that in the analysis makes it a lot easier for groups to sue the agency and say they've made a bad decision based on the analysis. So it will, it's hoped, guide agencies to making decisions that are going to be better for the environment. All right, the second thing I want to talk about is emissions regulations. So this is kind of the rules that come out to implement things like the Clean Air Act. Now, for most pollutants, we rely heavily on what are called technology standards for traditional pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, ozone, those kinds of things. So for example, when you buy a car, the manufacturer is required to install in the car a catalytic converter. That's a technology standard. Coal-fired power plants are required to have certain equipment to capture sulfur dioxide, those kinds of things. The equipment is laid out in the standard. For climate change, we rely more, or for greenhouse gas emissions rather, we rely more on performance standards, where we set kind of the performance that we want, and we allow the emitter to achieve that performance in the way that they think is the best. So for example, we tell appliance manufacturers that their appliances have to meet certain efficiency standards, but we don't tell them exactly how they have to do it. We tell auto manufacturers that their average fuel economy has to hit certain numbers. You can see the graph there that shows that how fuel economy has gone up as a result over time. We require car manufacturers to have a certain percentage of their sales be zero emission vehicles. Those kinds of things are performance standards. Power plant emissions for greenhouse gas it have been and will probably be in the future performance standards. So I want to talk a little bit more about how we have regulated power plant emissions in following the court ruling that says that we have to. So after 2009, the Obama administration was legally required to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. It took them a while to come up with a set of rules. They were not able, as I said, they couldn't go to Congress and say, write us some new laws to allow it to give us some new authority that's going to make this easier. So they had to work within what was available under the Clean Air Act. They came up with the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was basically a plan where each state was given a target that it had to hit for its total emissions. And the states were given a lot of flexibility in how to meet those targets. So the states might, for example, provide incentives for more polluting power plants to shut down and incentives for cleaner energy to be developed. That the Clean Power Plan was, there was a lawsuit by 27 states. The Clean Power Plan was put on hold while they resolved the lawsuit. The lawsuit basically said that the Clean Power Plan oversteps the authority that the EPA has under the Clean Air Act. When the Trump administration came into power, they scrapped the Clean Power Plan. They rescinded it and it replaced it. Now remember, they have to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what the courts have said. So they came up with a new rule called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which focused on individual emitters. rather than saying, overall, we want the system to be cleaner, it said that each individual emitter, each individual power plant has to use the best available technology to reduce emissions. Now, if you're a coal plant, that means you need to run your coal plant as the best coal plant you can run it. So it needs to be efficient. That mostly has to do with efficiency. How much of your heat that you're getting from your coal is being wasted. So the results are fairly modest. There's not a lot you can do with a coal plant to make it more efficient. They're running fairly efficiently already. In 2021, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule was ruled as not meeting, it was thrown out by the courts. It's hard to make new rules quickly, and there were some deficiencies in how the Affordable Clean Energy Rule was implemented, so that has been thrown out. Now, the Biden administration has a blank slate. The Clean Power Plan has been rescinded. The Affordable Clean Energy Rule has been thrown out. There is no rule on the books. So they get to write a new one, and that's going to take some time. So it's not clear when they're going to come up with a new rule. And it may be that some of the things coming out of Congress right now will help solve that problem. All right. Some of the things we don't necessarily think about as climate policy, one of the things has to do with government expenditures. The government spends a lot of money. So, for example, the government spends things to buys goods and services, and their spending on those kinds of things accounts for 17% of our economy. So how it spends that money makes a big difference. So under the Biden administration, the agencies are now tasked with thinking about climate change impacts when making purchasing decisions, for example. So they are allowed, for example, to buy a product that's more expensive if it has less of a climate impact and can use that social cost of carbon when considering what is the total cost of buying a particular good. So, for example, we see the Postal Service buying electric delivery trucks. The federal government gives away a lot of money to try to increase energy efficiency. So there are lots of grant programs for schools, for homes, and things like that to try to make them more efficient, and so on. Spends a lot of money on research. There's a good, strong economic argument in favor of the government funding research. That being mostly about the fact that when private industry funds research, they don't want to share the results, but we're all better off if research results are shared. So the government has a role to step in and fund some of this research. So it's been doing a lot of research on batteries and solar panels and things like that. And you can make the argument that the transition that we've seen so far in the electricity generation sector was built on a foundation that started with research that was largely funded by the federal government. It also spends a lot of money on demonstration projects to try to help commercialize some of the technologies that are being developed in the more basic research. So demonstration projects, for example, on carbon capture and sequestration. The last point I put on this slide is one that hasn't been happening, but was discussed during the Democratic primaries. During the Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders talked about nationalizing electricity generation so that the federal government would actually own generating plants and the grid to distribute electricity. This is how it's done in many other countries. But that Bernie Sanders obviously did not win the nomination, and that no one else seems to be that interested in going that route. All right, the next broad topic has to do with federal lands in the outer continental shelf. Two big issues here. One is leasing for fossil fuels. With oil and gas, in January of this year, President Biden imposed a moratorium on new oil and gas leases to give time to conduct a review of the whole leasing program. We wanted to look at the climate impacts of the leasing program, look at the environmental impacts of fracking, and to look at whether the royalty rates need to be reformed. Um, the moratorium did not stop drilling on leases that had already been sold, and drilling activity has not really slowed down. In June of this year, a court ruled, said that the moratorium was not legal. Again, it was a procedural problem. It's hard to do things quickly. Um, so the Biden administration now has said, okay, we will resume leasing while we try to litigate this in court. But the complaint is that they've been dragging their feet in getting new leasing going. They have a lot of discretion over how quickly they lease things. As long as they're holding some leasing, they're probably satisfying the court's requirement, but it's up to them to decide. It's up to the Department of Interior and those agencies to decide how much leasing should happen. With coal, 40% of the US coal is mined on public lands, so it's a pretty big deal. The Obama administration paused coal leasing in 2016, again, to conduct a review of the climate impacts and royalty payments. The Trump administration resumed leasing and canceled the review that was going to happen. The Biden administration has now restarted the review, but has not canceled leases. So coal leases are still being sold under the Biden administration. If we turn to renewable energy projects, there's a lot of contention over leasing over the outer continental shelf for wind, and there's a lot of contention over leasing federal lands for solar. And here there's some conflicts between different groups of environmentalists that go on. The Biden administration has been has been more favorable to opening up leasing. They've been doing some things to try to open up outer continental shelf leasing for wind. They have a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. It's been historically hard to build solar and wind projects on federal lands. And the Biden administration is right now trying to review its regulations to try to make it easier to lease those federal lands for renewable energy projects. So no changes yet, but it looks like there's going to be some down the road. Tax incentives are a popular way to try to incentivize production of renewable electricity. There's a few different types of tax incentives. There are production tax credits. This is a tax credit you get every time you produce a kilowatt hour of electricity from a renewable source. And a tax credit is better than a tax deduction because it's a dollar for dollar reduction in your taxes. So there are investment tax credits, which are a tax credit based on how much money you spend to build a wind farm or a solar farm. And these have been fairly important in driving installation of renewable electricity. So the graph that is shown there shows that in years when the production tax credit for wind expires, you hardly see any installation of new wind facilities. In years when there is a production tax credit, you see a lot. So the installers are very sensitive to these tax incentives. It's been argued that it's because the tax incentives are becoming less important now because wind and solar are becoming more competitive with fossil fuel sources. So right now they're scheduled to phase out within the next couple of years, though they may be renewed. There is a tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration or carbon capture and use. So if you collect carbon from a smokestack from a coal-fired power plant, for example, and you pump it underground and sequester it, you can get a tax credit. Or if you pump it into an oil well to try to enhance oil recovery, you can get a tax credit for that too. And then there are a lot of consumer tax credits. So if you buy an electric vehicle, you can get a tax credit. If you install new windows in your house, you can get a tax credit, those kinds of things. Those are also slated for, every few years they're scheduled to be to expire, and every few years they get renewed at slightly lower rates. Carbon pricing is something that has not been done in the US at the federal level. But it has been done in a lot of other countries. And there are two main ways, two main systems for carbon pricing. There are emission trading systems and carbon taxes. So emission trading systems used to be called cap and trade systems. That's now become a dirty word. The idea behind those is that emitters, for example, power plants, are given permits that allow them to emit greenhouse gases, but they're not given as many permits as they want. So they need to reduce their emissions in order to stay in compliance. Now, if they reduce their emissions by more than their permits allow, they can sell the extra permits they have to other emitters who are having trouble reducing their emissions. The idea is that if it's easy for some plants to reduce their emissions, we want them to reduce their emissions by a lot. If it's hard for other plants to reduce their emissions, we're willing to let them reduce their emissions by less because we want to save money. The idea is to save money in the whole system. So there are emission trading systems now in the European Union, China, California, New England, other countries as well. Those are the kind of the big ones and the ones that are close to home. In practice, most of these systems use a combination of free permits that are given away to emitters and permits that are sold in auctions. So if there aren't enough permits to go around, you can always buy more from if you pay enough money. The idea here is that we make it expensive to emit and make it profitable to reduce your emissions. That will give an incentive for emitters to reduce their emissions. The other type of carbon pricing system is a carbon tax. So this is a tax that is charged whenever fossil fuels are emitted. So typically it would be if you dig a ton of coal out of the ground, you have to pay a tax under the assumption that that coal is going to be burned. If you pump a barrel of oil, you have to pay a tax based on the carbon content of the fossil fuels. The carbon tax is by charging it at the mine mouth or at the wellhead, it is passed through to the entire economy. So that charge, that higher price, shows up everywhere energy is used and gives an incentive to use energy that's less carbon intensive or use less energy. So the idea again, make emitting carbon expensive and people will do less of it. Examples, there are a lot of countries that have or regions that have imposed carbon taxes. The prices they charge range a lot. Argentina is at $6 a ton. British Columbia is at $36 a ton. Sweden's at $137 a ton. Different countries and regions apply these taxes to different segments, but they're widely used. Both of these systems are widely used. In fact, of all developing countries in the world, only the United States and Australia don't have some form of a carbon pricing system, a national carbon pricing system. Now, why do economists like carbon pricing? First, it's a systemic approach. Once you make emitting carbon dioxide expensive, those prices will flow through the entire economy so that everyone making decisions at every level will be influenced by those incentives. As opposed to, say, regulating the electricity generation sector, which doesn't do anything for transportation. Second, it allows flexibility. You have the incentive now to reduce your carbon emissions, but it's up to you to decide how to do that. Whether if you want to drive less, take public transportation, move closer to your office, to reduce your use of gasoline, for example, you get to decide how to do it. It induces innovation. So when power plants are charged, or when power plants have to pay a higher price for coal based on emissions, they come up with innovative ways to try to reduce their emissions that are maybe cheaper than what we expected. We've seen this in previous systems where pricing has been used. that emitters are often very clever in figuring out ways to reduce their emissions when emissions become expensive. It doesn't pick winners. It just says whatever is the most efficient way to reduce carbon emissions is going to be the way we do it. If solar is the best way to generate electricity, then solar will be the one that wins in the marketplace. If coal with carbon capture and sequestration is the best way to reduce carbon emissions, then that's what's going to win in the marketplace. It achieves reductions of emissions at the lowest possible cost because everyone has an incentive to try to minimize the cost of that they face. And while it's not easy to administer, compared to other approaches that would accomplish the same thing, it is an easier system to administer. Now, there are some downsides to carbon pricing. One, it tends to be regressive, and by this we mean that lower income and minority households will be harder hit by higher energy prices that would result from carbon pricing than higher income, because they spend a larger proportion of their money on energy and energy-related goods. So most carbon pricing systems, and particularly most carbon tax systems, have a provision where some money is redistributed back to households to try to help lower income households that are hurt by these systems. So for example, if you have a carbon tax and you take all of the revenue that's generated and send it back to households as a dividend that's the same for all households, most about all of the lower income households will end up getting more money back than they spend in higher energy prices. So they will actually get net positive return for that. So it turns a regressive tax into a progressive system so that lower income households are made better off. Higher income households will end up spending more in higher prices than they get back in their dividend check because higher income households spend more on energy. Second downside is it does introduce some uncertainty over emissions reductions. Once you place a price on carbon, if the economy starts booming, emissions may go up, which would require you to increase the price. So you don't have as much control over emissions as you would through a regulatory scheme. Why haven't we had some carbon pricing system if almost every other developed country has? Well, first, this gets down to the politics. First, higher energy prices are political poison. No congressman wants to vote for something that's going to raise energy prices. Second, there is concern over the regressivity of carbon pricing systems, and there's worry that the redistribution of revenues won't be sufficient or won't fix that problem. Third, right now, Biden has made a pledge not to raise taxes on households making less than $400,000. A carbon tax, you could argue, would raise taxes on lower income households. You could argue that a dividend that makes those households whole would satisfy Biden's pledge, but it's not clear how that's going to be interpreted or whether Biden will consider that to be consistent with his pledge. The fourth issue has been conflict between progressive green advocates and environmental green advocates. Progressive green advocates have tended not to like carbon taxes because of their regressivity. They worry that carbon taxes would not reduce emissions as much as promised. There's a worry that once we place a tax on carbon emissions, the political establishment will become addicted to those tax revenues and will start doing things to try to increase fossil fuel emissions just to maximize taxes. And they argue that there are better ways to reduce emissions. For example, there was a letter sent to Congress by a group of progressive groups just in the last couple of days arguing against a carbon tax, saying that it would be much better to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies as a way to do something about climate. So there has been that tension within the left over whether carbon taxes are good or bad. The last kind of category I want to talk about is international relationships. We have treaties and agreements. The Paris Climate Agreement is kind of the big one here, has a goal. The revised goal now is to try to keep global temperature rise under 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. The Biden administration is re-entering us into the agreement. The agreement calls on each country to come up with its own targets for how much they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's mostly aspirational. The details are worked out at conferences called Conferences of the Parties, or COPs. And there's one coming up in November called COP26, and that's where all the details are worked out. How big are these pledges going to be? How are they going to be accomplished? What are we going to do about developing countries and things like that? Right now, the agreements that have been reached so far are not sufficient to get to meet a 1.5 degree goal. There was an analysis that looked at each country's plans and found that the countries that have current plans that are sufficient to meet a 1.5 degree goal, the only one is the Gambia. That's the only country that's on track. The US rating is considered insufficient, which is kind of the middle grade on a 5-point scale. So we have a long way to go, and almost all countries have a long way to go. The only developed country that I saw that were kind of in the second tier was the United Kingdom. On the trade side, if you regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and other countries don't, you put your manufacturers at a disadvantage in international trade because they're going to have higher costs than manufacturers from other countries. So the way we try to get around that is with what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the way this works, you put an import duty on imports that come from countries that regulate their carbon emissions less intensively than we do. And when one of our manufacturers exports to a country that doesn't have good regulations, we subsidize those exports. The idea is to try to level the playing field so that our manufacturers are competing on a level field with manufacturers from countries that aren't being as aggressive as we are. And the hope is also that will induce other countries to make their carbon regulations more aggressive, at least to match ours. There is the issue, how do you calculate the correct tariff? As we see, carbon emission regulation is very complicated, and to say that it's costing a company a certain amount of money for its product, it's very difficult to come up with those calculations. It's much easier if you have a carbon price. You can look at the price, you can see how much carbon emissions goes into the manufacture of a good, and say that's what it cost here, and then compare it to other countries. The European Union is planning a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is something that our exporters to the European Union are probably going to have to deal with within the next few years. The Biden administration has talked about implementing one here, but again, without a carbon pricing system like they have in the European Union, it's not exactly clear how you would set those tariffs. All right, so we talked a lot about different types of approaches that the federal government can take. This slide shows something about public opinion about different approaches. And what it shows is that the public generally likes federal policies that give away money. Incentives, rebates for installing solar panels or buying electric vehicles, money given for research. Generally, people are in favor of opening up public lands to renewable energy. A little less favorable toward regulation. but still fairly positive. The ones I've circled there in red are the actual policy tools rather than goals. The lower on, you can see a carbon tax. You can see that while 2/3 of Americans are in favor of a carbon tax with a dividend sent back, the support for that is lower than it is for other approaches. So if you ask people, what's your preferred method? Most people want something done about climate change. Even most Republicans want something done about climate change. But if you ask them, what's your preferred method? It's not many people say carbon tax. They tend to say give money away to get people to behave differently. That's the popular way to do it. All right, so what's going on in DC? So we have an infrastructure bill. These are passed about every 5 years. This is the highway bill. It's often called the highway bill. The current infrastructure bill is $1 trillion. It's mostly about building stuff like roads and bridges and water systems and the internet. There's a lot of money in there for fixing roads and bridges. There's a fair amount related to climate. There's a fair amount of money for adaptation, moving highways and water systems out of flood-prone areas, for example. Wildland firefighting. This is money aimed at dealing with the consequences of climate change, right? There's less money in it. There is some. There's less money in it to try to decarbonize the energy system. But there's some money for electric vehicle charging stations, electric buses, improvements to the electrical grid to allow renewable energy to be moved around the country where it's needed. There's some money for capping orphan gas wells to try to cut down on methane releases from those. These are built into the infrastructure bill as well. So where does it stand? It's already passed the Senate, 69-30. Our own Senator Tester voted in favor. Our Senator Daines voted against it. So right now it's waiting for the House. Progressives in the House see this bill as leverage. They're more interested in the other bill that's coming up, which is the reconciliation bill, which has a lot of the things that they want. So they've said that they will not support the infrastructure bill unless it is paired with the reconciliation bill. And if the infrastructure bill comes to the House without the reconciliation bill, they have threatened to vote it down. And there are enough of them to do that. So the original plan was to move both bills together. I'll talk more about the reconciliation bill in a bit. Move both bills together so that the progressives in the House are satisfied that they're going to get what they want. That's not going to happen because the reconciliation bill is not ready. The new plan right now is to vote on the infrastructure bill in the House tomorrow. The progressives are saying they're going to vote against it. The leadership in the House hopes that they can get far enough on the reconciliation bill that they can give some concrete promises about what the reconciliation bill will contain, and that'll be enough to satisfy the progressives in the House. There's also the possibilities that Republicans may come to the rescue here. Remember, the original bill was passed in a bipartisan way in the Senate. There are some Republicans who might look favorably on the bill. There are business groups like the Chamber of Commerce that are lobbying Republicans very hard to support the bill, particularly some of the centrist Republicans. Our own Congressman Matt Rosendale has not come out with a clear statement about whether he's in favor of the reconciliation bill or rather the infrastructure bill or opposed to it. So there is an open question about how time sensitive the infrastructure bill is. Nancy Pelosi has promised that there's going to be a vote on it tomorrow, but it's not clear what horrible thing will happen if that vote doesn't happen tomorrow. The current authority for highway spending runs out at the end of tomorrow, but there may be a way around that, which I'll mention in a second. But if so it may be the compromise here may be to delay the infrastructure bill until the reconciliation bill is closer to being passed. All right, so turning to the reconciliation bill. So right now, it's been targeted at 3.5 trillion total costs. That's what's called the top line number. Of that, 1 trillion is for climate related stuff. So there's lots of things in there that progressives like. There's universal preschool, free community college, paid family and medical leave, expansion of Medicare and Medicaid, things like that, things that the progressives are hoping for. The climate stuff is not the stuff that the progressives are as focused on. They're focused more on the social safety net kinds of pieces. It is not fully paid for. The tax changes that are being incorporated will not be enough to pay the whole 3.5 trillion. But there are a number that are being bandied about. Remember, this is being written right now. So it's not entirely clear what's going to come out in the reconciliation bill. These are some of the things that we think are in it at this point. Related to climate, what are the things that are in the reconciliation bill? Well, the one that's gotten the most noise is what's called the Clean Electricity Performance Program. Now, this is a budget-based approach to reducing emissions from the electricity sector. It has to be budget-based or it can't be included in the reconciliation bill. You can't just regulate in this. It has to have something to do with revenues or expenditures. The idea is that generators will be given a 4% target that they should increase their clean energy production by 4% per year. If they do more than that, they get paid a bonus. If they do less than that, they get fined. They basically have to pay a penalty. So the idea is to try to incentivize generators to increase production of clean electricity. Now it focuses on new generation. It doesn't really talk much about what happens with existing generation. So it doesn't say you have to close down your natural gas plants, for example. It just says we want you to build more solar and wind. Though as we build more solar and wind, for example, we're going to see more of a transition. I should point out 4% per year is probably way too slow to hit the goals that we really need to hit. So it's not a very aggressive program. The second piece is a fee on methane emissions. Now, this would only cover the oil and gas industry, which, according to the EPA, is only responsible for about 30% of total methane emissions. But oil and gas producers would have to pay a fee on methane emissions. It's not clear how those will be measured. Those are difficult to measure. In some cases, there's talk about charging the fee based on average emissions for the industry. The problem there is that doesn't give any incentive to actually reduce your emissions if you're going to have to pay your fee based on other people's emissions. So there are some issues there. The third piece that people have paid attention to is what's called the Civilian Climate Corps. This would be a group of probably young people going out and doing projects. Mostly we're having to do with adaptation. It would be run through the AmeriCorps probably. So we would pay young people a small amount of money to go out and do things like restore forests, help communities adapt to climate change, those kinds of things. Other things that have received less attention. The reconciliation bill would extend the investment tax credits and production tax credits for renewable generation. It would also expand those to include storage and transmission. So again, trying to incentivize more renewable generation, incentivize more storage, and incentivize improving the transmission infrastructure. There's more money for direct investments in grid improvements, similar to what was in the infrastructure bill. More money for electric vehicles, charging stations, etc. And there's more money to give away to people to help them transition toward electricity in heating and those kinds of things, what we call electrification. The idea is that over time, as our electricity sector gets cleaner, we want people to use more electricity and less, say, natural gas or heating oil. There is talk about a carbon tax in the reconciliation bill, mostly on the Senate side. The Senate is much more favorable to a carbon tax right now than the House is. Ron Wyden is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, has been pushing for this. What I've read is that the proposals are for $15 per ton. Some of the money would be used to pay for the reconciliation bill, but some of the money would go back to households as a dividend. Those dividends may be targeted toward lower income households. There's been an argument about why are we sending dividends to high-income households? They don't need the money. It would include a border adjustment. There's talk about exempting gasoline because, as I said, raising energy prices is not politically popular. So that's possible. We don't know whether that's going to come out of the Senate version or not. The other big question mark has to do with fossil fuel subsidies. There was a consideration in the House version to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, but that was not carried forward. So it's still possible. There's been push by, as I said, progressive groups to use that as an approach to try to reduce carbon emissions. So it may show up again, but it doesn't look like it's in the current versions. So right now, the reconciliation bill is something of a high wire act. The Senate does not have any room. The Democrats in the Senate doesn't have any room for defections. The key people here, there are really two key people. There's a third that I'll mention in a second. The two key people in the Senate are Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Joe Manchin, they both have indicated reservations about the reconciliation bill. Neither one is very happy about the total cost of the bill. And so I think the reality is hitting the Democrats that the top line number is going to be something less than 3.5 trillion, something probably in the low twos. And so the big question is that going to be enough to keep the progressives in the House happy? Joe Manchin does not like the Clean Energy Performance Program. He has said that the electricity sector is transitioning toward renewables anyway. Why would we pay them to do things they're doing anyway? You have to remember that West Virginia is a coal and gas producing state, but perhaps equally important, West Virginia gets 96% of its electricity from coal. So if we make coal more expensive, that's going to be a big hit on ratepayers in West Virginia, which is not politically popular. He's skeptical of a carbon tax. He has not ruled one out completely, but he has not said kind things about it. It's helpful to remember that prior to being in the Senate, he founded a coal brokerage firm. He gave up control of that firm when he got elected, but he still owns a lot of that firm. And last year he earned $500,000 in dividends from his ownership stake. So two things. One, obviously there's a conflict of interest there, but every senator faces conflicts of interest. The second is he may not personally buy into the collective wisdom that coal is on its deathbed. He may see that the performance of the coal industry shows that it still has some life left in it. Kyrsten Sinema has been much more quiet about what she wants. She's not happy about the top line number. She's opposed to some of the tax increases that have been proposed. She has made noises that make her sound like she might support a carbon tax, but she's very difficult to read. There's been a lot of tea leaf reading going on with Kyrsten Sinema, trying to figure out what it is she really wants. So where do things stand? There's going to be a vote on a continuing resolution in the Senate today, or at least there should be one. That vote may include extension of highway funding, which would take some of the pressure off of the infrastructure bill, of the timing of the infrastructure bill. On the debt limit, yesterday, Mitch McConnell blocked an attempt to increase the debt limit in the Senate. It could be that an increase in the debt limit has to be included into the reconciliation bill so that it could be passed using only Democrats. Chuck Schumer has said that won't happen. So it looks right now that there's a game of chicken going on between Mitch McConnell and the Democrats over the debt limit. It will probably get resolved in the end, but it's not clear right now how. I mentioned three key people in the Senate. The third key person in the Senate is the Senate parliamentarian. And that's the person who decides whether a particular part of the reconciliation bill can fit within that context. Remember, it has to have a budget. has to be linked to the budget. So things are very busy in the Capitol right now. So here's a quote I pulled from one of the pieces that I was looking at. Maybe the most consequential one on Capitol Hill in a generation. If we don't get significant climate change legislation passed this session, it's very likely that we won't get another chance until 2025. And as we see, we need to, if we're going to achieve, going to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to be turning that corner much quicker than that. So I'll stop there and see, Paige, if there are any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Reddy. That was such an informative presentation. It does look like it's the top of the hour, and so to respect everyone's time, I think it may be best to direct questions to your email. Would that be okay with you, Rich?
That would be fine with me. It could be richard.reddy@montana.edu.
Wonderful. I will put that in